Did you know that during the Cold War, the US government ran various different human and animal experiments, all to test the effects of various different illegal psychoactive drugs and chemicals? Well, you might have. This probably isn't earth-shattering news to a lot of you, but you might have not heard of this time that they did it. Hello everybody, my name is Chase. Welcome to Scare Files. Today we're talking about the Edgewood Arsenal human experiments. I'm very excited for this video because this is something that I find very interesting and I really don't see it talked about a lot. So without me wasting any more of your time, let's get into it. If you like the video, like, subscribe, and do all that. Thank you so much for watching. Edgewood Arsenal is a US military facility in Maryland. It was established in 1917 and it was dedicated to the research, development, and testing of multiple different chemical warfare agents. Edgewood Arsenal is still around, but it is completely different people working there now who were not associated with this at all, and they don't do this type of stuff anymore, at least as far as we know. The creation of Edgewood Arsenal was driven by the US military's need to develop and produce these chemical weapons in response to the widespread use of chemical warfare during the First World War. But from 1955 to 1975, during peak tensions of the Cold War, Edgewood Arsenal became the site of highly classified and very morally questionable human experiments. These experiments can only be described as horrific and inhumane, with the goal of them being to explore different doses of numerous different chemical agents and how they could be used to incapacitate enemies during wartime. In total, over 7,000 soldiers and civilian volunteers were tested on, as well as countless different animals, and at least 254 chemical agents were tested. These chemicals ranged anywhere from caffeine and alcohol to weed and LSD, to even hallucinogens specifically designed at Edgewood Arsenal to induce a state of psychosis. Now, you may have noticed that I referred to the civilians as volunteers, and the soldiers were technically volunteers as well, but it's very questionable how much the government actually disclosed to them about the experiments. On the surface level, this really sounded like a vacation more than anything. The government enticed soldiers by promising them financial compensation, of course, as well as a very easy work schedule. 3 off days for every 4 days on duty, with most days off being weekends. They would also get to stay at Edgewood Arsenal, which doesn't look like a lot of other US military facilities, so this change of scenery was also seen to be a plus. But the soldiers were never fully informed about what they would be subject to while at Edgewood Arsenal. And they didn't know the chemical agents that were going to be tested on them either. They were really going in blind. Researchers would just take a soldier, drug them up by giving them a gas or injecting them with something, and then sit back and observe their reaction to it, all while the soldier is screaming, asking what he was just given. When I say soldiers, I'm also referring to the civilian volunteers, but the soldiers outnumbered them greatly. The experiments were widely made up of soldiers. Also, like I mentioned earlier, animal experiments were being ran at the same time at Edgewood, but this video is going to be focusing on the human experiments, but there are multiple different videos that you can find out there of the animal experiments, them testing LSD on a cat or mustard gas on a goat. The only real assurance that these soldiers had were that the chemical agents that were being tested on them were designed to incapacitate and not to kill them. A psychochemical warfare program ran by the US government during the height of the Cold War. Is anyone else getting deja vu? This all sounds very similar to MK Ultra, with the main differences being that MK Ultra, from what I know, was testing on many more civilians, and the MK Ultra tests were primarily focused on the idea of a drug-induced mind control, whereas at Edgewood, they were focused on the development of a chemical warfare weapon that could incapacitate enemy soldiers. You could even argue that this was a noble goal, because in theory, this would limit casualties on both sides. But spoiler alert, this all ended up being for nothing and a bunch of people suffered for no reason. Some of the first chemicals tested were cannabinoids and THC derivatives, but these were found to be too weak and ineffective as they didn't neutralize soldiers in combat scenarios. At the beginning, researchers were also hopeful that LSD would be able to be weaponized, but again, it was proven to be ineffective, as in high-pressure scenarios, soldiers were still able to pull it together and perform. Another substance being tested by research at the start of the experiments was PCP, or bath salts, which very quickly proved to be far too unpredictable in the way that it altered behavior to ever be deployed in military use. PCP was developed in the 50s, so they didn't have a lot of information on it, of course, but the idea of trying to weaponize it is so funny to me. At least in the context of giving it to the enemy in order to incapacitate them, because this thing is like the last thing that you want to give to an enemy soldier before you go in and try to fight them. If anything, it's like a performance enhancer. You could not pay me enough money to fight a guy on fucking bath salts. However, in the late 1950s, researchers began experimenting with another compound that had just been synthesized earlier in the decade. This chemical was given the code name EA2277 by the US military and was later known as BZ by NATO. EA, of course, standing for Edgewood Arsenal because it was developed there. This chemical, which I'm going to be referring to as BZ, was an odorless and bitter-tasting anticholinergic stabilized in a white crystalline powder. Acetylcholine plays multiple vital roles in your brain relating to motor function and cognition. So you could probably guess that blocking too much of this neurotransmitter is a very bad thing, and it produces a wide variety of side effects, including impaired cognition and drastic short-term memory loss, impaired motor control, and even the loss of intentional movement at all. And most disturbingly, extremely vivid hallucinations that seem identical to real life. Now, all anticholinergics produce similar side effects to these. Benadryl comes to mind immediately, and its side effects in high doses are virtually the exact same. It produces a state of delirium, essentially a psychosis. The main difference being is that BZ was just much stronger and more potent. These side effects, when produced by Benadryl, can last anywhere from 12 to 16 hours, maybe even upwards of 24 hours, depending on the dose. And that's a very long time to be in a psychosis for. But the peak of a BZ psychosis, because it's really not a trip, lasts 3 days, with lingering effects lasting anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks. Like I said, with this stuff, you cannot differentiate what is a hallucination and what is actually real. So soldiers were stuck like this for a minimum of 3 days after being dosed. And as I stated, BZ is incredibly potent, with just 1 milligram, which was said to be the size of a grain of sand, being able to produce these effects in soldiers consistently. In comparison, to produce similar effects with Benadryl that last a much shorter period of time, a user would need anywhere from 500 to 700 milligrams at the least, or around 20 to 30 pills. So for all these reasons, the government was very hopeful to weaponize BZ in the near future. Shortly after the testing with BZ began being held in the late 1950s, in 1962, Dr. James Ketchum, an Army psychiatrist, was assigned to lead the testing of psychochemicals at Edgewood Arsenal. Ketchum was a big believer that BZ could be strategically deployed during warfare in order to minimize casualties. These beliefs, along with immense amount of pressure from the Cold War and paranoia surrounding the Soviets' own advancements in psychochemicals, led Dr. Ketchum and his team to disregard health concerns and the potential long-term consequences of what these soldiers were being exposed to. In all, nearly 300 soldiers were exposed to BZ during these human experiments, and of those 300, 20 of them were chosen to be given a higher dose in order to observe more extreme effects. These tests included various methods of administration, including intramuscular injections, inhalation, oral intake, and even transdermal exposure. After being dosed and waiting for the effects to kick in, which could take anywhere from 2 to 3 hours, soldiers were asked a variety of questions. They would be asked questions like how they're feeling and if the effects are growing, diminishing, or staying the same, as well as questions like, where are you, or do you know what day it is? They would also be given basic problems to solve like simple math equations, all of this of course to test cognitive function under the influence of BZ. The most notable tests occurred in 1963, when Dr. Ketchum and his team decided to simulate real combat scenarios. They created a mock outpost with enough supplies and food to last 4 soldiers 3 days. Of the 4 soldiers chosen for this experiment, 2 would receive a regular dose of BZ, with 1 receiving a placebo and the other receiving a high incapacitating dose. Researchers set up cameras in the outpost and got ready to observe how these soldiers would respond to a variety of fake scenarios. The 2 soldiers who were given the moderate dose of BZ were able to function during some of these mock scenarios, but they made numerous mistakes without correcting them, and they were very clearly incapacitated. Ronald Zadrozny, the soldier who was given the high dose, was completely unable to function during any of these scenarios. When a simulated chemical alarm sounded and soldiers were expected to put on their gas masks, Zadrozny was unable to do even that, and other soldiers had to help him get the gas mask on his face. Zadrozny was also completely unable to sleep during the first night. Researchers observed him staying awake for over 36 hours straight, the whole time experiencing vivid hallucinations and looking for a way to escape the outpost. Several other combat tests followed, including exposing soldiers to BZ in gas form. They would take these soldiers, put them in the back of pickup trucks, and then drive them through the BZ gas, only to be taken back to the doctors and researchers so they could observe the effects. Then these men would be asked to carry out several different patrol missions, and their performance would be compared to another group of soldiers not under the effects of BZ. As you could probably guess by now, these soldiers were extremely incapacitated, and to the US military, that looked very promising, which led them to order over 100,000 pounds of BZ. You might remember me saying that this was all for nothing, and it was, because even though the US spent tons of money ordering 100,000 pounds of this stuff, it was never actually deployed in combat. At least not officially and not by the US. In 1998, the British Ministry of Defense accused Iraq of stockpiling a large amount of something known as Agent 15, which was believed to be likely chemically identical to BZ, or at least very similar to it. BZ was also allegedly used during the 2002 Moscow theater hostage crisis to incapacitate a group of terrorists, and as a result, 115 hostages perished. And in January of 2013, an unidentified US administration official claimed that Syria had made a compelling case that Agent 15, or BZ, was used in Homs. But none of these incidents were ever confirmed to have actually been usage of BZ or something chemically identical, and as far as what is official, BZ has never actually been deployed. In 1975, the program at Edgewood Arsenal was abruptly terminated, likely due to ethical concerns and public scrutiny, and by 1989, the US claimed to have disposed of their entire stockpile of BZ. Volunteers were forced into oaths of secrecy and were prohibited from talking about the experiments at Edgewood for at least the next 15 years, with penalties of up to 20 years in prison for breaking the oath, which is crazy to think about. These experiments started before my parents were born, and this year would be the first time that a volunteer could openly speak about it. Till the end, Dr. Ketchum insisted that this research was necessary and that no volunteers were harmed in any way, claiming that it was no different than a dream for most of them because of the heavily impaired memory. However, now we know that anticholinergic substances have a long list of long-term health side effects, like hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, early onset dementia, and organ failure, just to name a few. And many soldiers faced adverse effects later in life following their time spent at Edgewood. Movement disorders and tremors, psychological issues like HPPD and PTSD, and even cancer were among the most commonly reported. One of the most tragic outcomes of all of this comes from Ronald Zadrozny, the soldier who was given the high dose of BZ in the original mock combat scenario. In 1995, 20 years after the experiments ended, Zadrozny would take the life of his third wife, followed by his own. Of course, there's no way to say for sure if this was the sole reason that this happened, and if Zadrozny had never spent time at Edgewood, things would have ended up differently, but it surely didn't help. In conclusion, the government does some pretty sketchy shit sometimes, huh? It's crazy to think that all of these people went through all of this for literally no reason at all, and all of the researchers were protected the entire time, so these people never actually got any sort of justice for what was done to them. Even if you think the researchers shouldn't have faced any punishment because it was for research purposes, I think these people undoubtedly deserved some sort of compensation, and they never got that. And it's always scary to me to read about things that the government has done, especially things that they've done pretty recently, because they could absolutely be doing this stuff now, and we would not know about it for the next 50 years, 100 years. Joking, obviously, I love the government, and they would never do something like this to us now. Anyways, if you have any thoughts of this of your own, drop them in the comments because I'd love to read them. I read every single comment, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps me out a lot, and you get to see more content like this. My name is Chase. This has been Scare Files. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video entertaining or interesting in a morbid way at least. Anyways, I'll see you again in the next video.